Most people picture borders as clean lines, but once you zoom in, the map starts behaving in ways that don't match common sense. Roads switch states without warning, rivers abandon their roles, and entire towns feel misplaced, creating odd stories hiding right in plain sight. Everything begins with the moment you realize these strange borders are not rare mistakes, but scattered all across the country, shaping daily routines and forcing people to adapt to boundaries drawn long before modern life created new challenges around them. The countdown starts with easier examples, guiding you into a world where the map slowly loses order, and the choices made by tired surveyors, shifting rivers, and bold landowners start affecting real families living along these mismatched lines. At number 50 sits the Kentucky Bend, a pocket of land cut off from the rest of Kentucky, where residents must drive through Tennessee just to reach their own state, creating a life shaped by a border molded entirely by a looping river. The people there grow up knowing their nearest Kentucky neighbor lives miles away, separated not by mountains, but by a water bend that wrapped around the land in such a strange arc, it isolated an entire community unintentionally. At number 49, the Northwest Angle appears, a chunk of Minnesota that requires a drive through Canada to reach, forcing residents to carry passports for simple errands, while depending on snowmobiles or boats during tough winters to stay connected. Life in the Northwest Angle revolves around managing border checks, as casually as grocery runs, with children learning early that trips to nearby towns require navigating international crossings shaped by an old treaty error left untouched for generations. At number 48 stands Point Roberts, a tiny American community stranded below the 49th parallel, where locals must pass through Canada to reach the rest of the country, living with the constant reminder that their home sits on the edge of two worlds. Families in Point Roberts learn to time their days carefully around border hours, balancing school schedules, shopping trips, and medical appointments with passport checks, because a straight line across the map cut them off from their own state. Number 47 brings Carter Lake, Iowa, a place marooned on the Nebraska side of the Missouri River after the river abandoned its old path, leaving behind a community that feels misplaced every time drivers cross confusing jurisdiction lines around the area. Residents of Carter Lake navigate laws, services, and emergency responses that often align with one state while physically sitting inside another's territory, all because a powerful river shifted course and froze legal borders in a past that no longer exists. Number 46 highlights Ellis Island, a historic site split between New York and New Jersey due to old water lines and a Supreme Court decision, turning a symbolic place into a shared patchwork that changes jurisdiction depending on which part you stand on. Visitors stepping across Ellis Island often cross state boundaries without noticing, unaware that the ground beneath them belongs partly to New Jersey, even though the island's identity is tied heavily to New York's long immigration history. At number 45 stands the Four Corners Monument, the point where four states meet cleanly on paper, yet exact measurements show the monument sits slightly off, creating endless debates over where the true intersecting point should have actually landed. People travel long distances to place a hand or foot in each state at once, unaware that early surveyors lacked the tools to place the marker perfectly, creating a small but fascinating mismatch between belief and historical accuracy. Number 44 focuses on the tiny New Hampshire Panhandle at Portsmouth Harbor, shaped by rushed colonial deals that left a narrow strip jutting awkwardly along the coast, placing homes and businesses inside a geographic shape barely noticed by most maps. Residents there live in a thin corridor, created only because colonial negotiators swapped land quickly to secure harbor access, leaving behind a border shape that looks more like a leftover scrap of territory than a planned piece of a state. At number 43, the California-Nevada border showcases jagged angles caused by survey errors, where straight lines on paper became sudden zigs and zags once crews in the field tried following poorly drawn instructions across rough desert terrain. These mismatched points still impact nearby communities that follow licensing rules, police authority, and land use laws that can flip with a single step, all because early mapping mistakes grew too embedded to ever be corrected. Number 42 brings attention to the Oklahoma Panhandle, a long strip formed by outdated slavery laws that left the land unattached to any state until later decisions finally placed it under Oklahoma's control, creating a region with a complicated birth. People living there grew up hearing stories about how the Panhandle almost became a separate territory entirely, giving the region a sense of identity shaped by a narrow, isolated stretch of land that was never supposed to stay empty. At number 41 appears the Maryland-West Virginia zigzag, a border defined more by old railroad routes than natural geography, leaving the line twisting around tracks and schedules long forgotten by nearly everyone except locals, who still live with the shape. Communities near this zigzag deal with property lines that shift unexpectedly, with homes positioned so close to the border that utilities, taxes, and school districts rarely match up cleanly, all due to decisions anchored to abandoned rail corridors. Number 40 brings the Delaware Wedge, a sliver of land left behind by circular borders and unclear early measurement tools, creating decades of uncertainty for families unsure which state could claim their land until final rulings settled the confusion. The people living in the wedge watched as surveyors returned again and again, each group believing earlier teams miscalculated something important, leaving the community caught between two identities while waiting for officials to draw a firm line. At number 39 sits the 12-mile circle around New Castle, Delaware, one of the few circular borders in the nation, shaping land in a perfect radius that cuts across rivers, neighborhoods, and landscapes with no concern for how people actually live. Number 38 introduces the Michigan-Ohio-Toledo Strip, a stretch of swampy land that once pushed both states to prepare militias, showing how even unremarkable terrain can spark major conflict when pride, resources, and political control collide along a disputed border. Families living near the Toledo Strip today often hear stories passed down about how this quiet stretch almost became the site of a full-scale clash, all because two states followed survey lines that disagreed by only a few miles. Number 37 reveals Vermont's notches, those small bites missing from the border where ancient landowner agreements shaped odd edges that remain visible on every map, reminding residents that personal deals once carried enough weight to permanently reshape geographic boundaries. Communities near these notches live with quirky property lines that don't match typical expectations, creating a daily reminder that much of America's map was built through small, practical decisions made long before anyone imagined future generations living around them. At number 36 sits the town of Bristol, where Tennessee and Virginia share one main street divided cleanly by a painted line, forcing locals to navigate two state systems while living within arm's reach of neighbors governed by completely different rules. People in Bristol often describe life defined by simple acts, like crossing the road to attend schools, pay taxes, or deal with law enforcement that changes authority mid-block, creating an unusual rhythm that blends two state identities every day. Number 35 brings us to Texarkana, a place where Texas and Arkansas share a courthouse positioned directly on the border, turning the building into a symbol of two cultures tied together by a structure that serves residents from both sides simultaneously. Walking near that courthouse, locals often step across the state line dozens of times without noticing, living in a merged community shaped by businesses, events, and public services that rely on cooperation despite differing laws on each side. Number 34 reveals the jagged border between Oregon and Washington, created when early mapmakers followed river channels that shifted and split unpredictably, leaving behind a line filled with odd bends that influence everything from fishing rights to property boundaries. People living along this boundary understand how confusing those bends can be, especially where suddenly shifting water levels once altered access to certain areas, shaping disputes and discussions about land that doesn't match the smooth lines expected on modern maps. Number 33 highlights West Wendover and Wendover, two towns sharing one community divided by the Nevada-Utah border, where one side embraces casinos and nightlife, while the other follows stricter rules, creating a unique split in lifestyle across a single shared landscape. Residents often joke that a person can cross into a completely different world by simply walking a few feet, yet living on either side means adapting to different laws, services, and opportunities despite sharing the same streets and neighborhoods. At number 32 lies the Colorado-Nebraska boot heel, an odd indentation created by surveyors who misjudged the 41st parallel, carving out a misplaced corner that still shapes county boundaries and farming routes around a point that was never meant to exist. People living in the boot heel often inherit stories about how the mistake lingered long enough to become permanent, leaving their homes inside a geographic feature born entirely from an old misunderstanding of where a simple line was supposed to run. Number 31 introduces the Virginia-Kentucky border bulge, created when early settlers mistook certain mountain ridges for others, carving out a border shape influenced more by assumptions and rugged terrain than by any accurate understanding of the region's geography. Families along this bulge live with a boundary that bends unexpectedly around hills and valleys, creating a patchwork of land ownership and county responsibilities shaped by the confusion of settlers who navigated mountains without reliable tools or clear visibility. Number 30 focuses on the South Carolina-Georgia border, where shifting river islands left behind a line that no longer matches the real landscape, forcing communities to adjust to a boundary drawn around features that nature eventually rearranged. Locals near this border often deal with property questions tied to islands that moved, shrank, or merged, leaving legal boundaries stuck in a past version of the river, while modern maps struggle to represent what the land actually looks like now. Number 29 showcases the New York-Connecticut Panhandle, a strange shape born from colonial arguments where neither side wanted to back down, resulting in a notch that still affects zoning, school districts, and community identity for those living inside it. Residents there often learn early that their location carries a unique history, as old rivalries created a border shape that left them belonging to Connecticut geographically, but surrounded partly by New York communities with different expectations and services. Number 28 brings us to Bluefield, a town split across West Virginia and Virginia, where backyards, driveways, and entire hillsides cross into neighboring territory, forcing families to adapt to a dual identity shaped by a border that divides without warning. Life in Bluefield often flows between two states naturally, with residents moving across the line for work or school while still maintaining separate rules and responsibilities, creating a community that blends state identities more closely than most places ever experience. Number 27 introduces the Idaho Chimney, a tall, narrow strip reaching north toward Canada, created because early mapmakers had only vague ideas about where the Rockies stood, leaving a border that stretched awkwardly across land few had properly explored. People within this narrow reach often travel long distances through terrain shaped by the accident of a vertical strip that feels disconnected from the rest of Idaho, yet remains a permanent part of the state due to decisions made far from the land itself. Number 26 focuses on the Arkansas-Missouri curve, a stretch where the border bends sharply around abandoned meandering rivers that once shaped farmland and routes, leaving modern residents living inside a shape influenced more by ancient water patterns than present-day geography. Number 25 introduces the long-running Tennessee-Georgia border dispute, where Georgia argues the line sits a mile too far south, leaving the state without direct access to the Tennessee River and creating decades of tension built around a simple surveying mistake. Communities near this disputed edge hear stories about political efforts to correct the line, yet nothing changes, and residents continue living beside a border marked not only by geography, but also by ongoing debates about who should control key natural resources. Number 24 highlights the Mississippi-Alabama-Tennessee tri-state point, a confusing junction created when inconsistent surveying left the exact meeting location offset, shaping land ownership and county limits in ways that feel mismatched when compared to the surrounding landscape. People living near this tri-point often describe the strange feeling of standing where maps disagree, knowing that their counties and states converge in a place defined not by careful planning, but by the limitations of early teams navigating tough terrain. Number 23 shifts attention to Kansas, a state famous for straight borders that turn out less perfect when examined closely, showing how even long, clean lines can wobble slightly when surveyors face challenging distances across plains and shifting environmental conditions. Residents near these subtle wobbles often don't notice the differences until dealing with property issues or land divisions, discovering that slight offsets created generations ago still shape how modern communities organize their homes, farms, and legal jurisdictions. Number 22 focuses on the West Virginia-Ohio River Islands, where ownership belongs to West Virginia, even when the islands sit on Ohio's side of the river, forming a confusing arrangement rooted in old agreements tied to navigational rights. Locals who live near these islands often grow up hearing unusual stories about how the river's flow changed over time, while the ownership stayed fixed, leaving these pieces of land under one state's authority despite their physical placement near another. Number 21 introduces the Indiana-Kentucky boundary along the Ohio River, where the legal border follows the river's old path even though the river shifted long ago, leaving Indiana with land physically located on Kentucky's present-day side. People along this stretch deal with the unusual reality that the river's natural movements no longer match legal lines, leading to properties, docks, and farmland belonging to Indiana while sitting much closer to communities and services in Kentucky. Number 20 explores the Arizona-Nevada border, shaped by countless changes in the Colorado River, leaving behind bends that no longer reflect the river's path and creating a patchwork of land where the border appears to follow ghosts of past water channels. Residents near these shifting borders often describe challenges tied to the river's unpredictable legacy, especially where mapping, development, and water rights must adapt to a line that matches old geography instead of the modern shape of the land. Number 19 introduces Texhoma, a town split cleanly between Texas and Oklahoma, where everything from school systems to utilities carries dual versions, forcing families to navigate two sets of structures while sharing one tightly connected community. People living in Texhoma often move between both sides of town naturally, embracing local traditions built around blended identities, yet still managing important differences in laws, taxes, and services determined simply by which street their home sits on. Number 18 highlights a small piece of Michigan unexpectedly attached to Wisconsin, shaped by changes in Lake Michigan's water levels that altered shorelines and left behind a portion of land claimed by one state but accessible only from another. Residents near this area grow accustomed to explaining how the land became misaligned with expectations, living beside a border shaped not through argument or surveyor error, but through the unpredictable nature of lake levels shifting over long periods. Number 17 focuses on the dented Alabama-Florida border, formed when hurried surveying and political compromise produced an uneven line, leaving communities along the boundary with a shape that feels less intentional and more like a leftover result of rushed decisions. People near this dent often speak about how their towns and counties stretch around a border that bends unexpectedly, shaping property plots and county responsibilities in ways that differ sharply from the clean lines seen on maps of nearby areas. Number 16 shifts to the Rhode Island-Massachusetts boundary, filled with small jogs created during colonial disagreements and misread surveys, leaving behind a border that zigzags around areas where early officials argued over access, ownership, and natural markers. Residents along this line often grow up hearing about how their neighborhoods ended up with unusual shapes, living near a boundary carved by decisions made long before modern transportation, zoning, and community planning reshaped expectations for how borders should function. Number 15 introduces the famous Missouri Boothel, created when a wealthy landowner convinced Congress to place his plantation inside Missouri rather than Arkansas, turning personal influence into a permanent geographic feature that still affects state identity. People in the Boothel live in a region that feels slightly separated from the rest of Missouri, shaped by a border created for reasons that have little to do with natural features or community needs, yet still define their daily experiences today. Number 14 highlights the New Mexico-Arizona border, believed to be a straight line until detailed measurements reveal subtle angles and offsets caused by 19th century surveyors struggling to maintain accuracy across long distances and difficult terrain. Communities near this line sometimes discover these small mismatches only during land assessments or construction projects, learning that the border drawn to appear perfect on maps hides imperfections left behind by limited tools and tough conditions. Number 13 brings attention to the Mason-Dixon line's quirks, including areas where the boundary bends around old land grants, creating pockets of land shaped not by clean survey work, but by promises and agreements that predate modern expectations of accuracy. Number 12 highlights the Florida-Georgia border lakes, where massive artificial reservoirs later covered the original boundary, leaving the line running through water that never existed when surveyors first marked it, forcing modern maps to honor a landscape long submerged. People who live near these lakes often describe a strange sense of separation between the legal border and the physical one, as property markers and jurisdictional responsibilities extend across waters that swallowed old landmarks and changed how communities connect. Number 11 showcases the Tennessee Notch into North Carolina, created when early survey teams navigating the mountains repeatedly lost their bearings, leaving behind a border that dips in sharply and continues influencing county boundaries and mountain routes today. Residents near this notch often learn how their region's identity formed around mistakes made by explorers struggling through dense forests, where misread ridgelines turned into permanent features shaping everything from school districts to emergency response coverage. Number 10 introduces the Oklahoma zigzags around native reservation boundaries, where treaties established shapes that no longer match today's population centers, creating a border that bends abruptly and still reflects agreements that shaped regional identity generations ago. People near these zigzags often navigate a complicated mix of jurisdictions, as land once reserved through treaty rights now blends with growing towns, leaving a border that preserves historical decisions while influencing how services, laws, and responsibilities overlap. Number 9 focuses on the New Jersey-Pennsylvania River boundary, where islands that form and disappear over time continue to complicate ownership, leaving both states responsible for areas that don't always appear on modern maps the way they once did. Communities along the river often experience moments when rising water, shifting sediment, or newly exposed patches of land force counties to revisit old rulings, reminding everyone that natural forces still challenge the idea of fixed borders. Number 8 introduces the Connecticut-Rhode Island bump, a border twist created when colonial farmers argued over pasture land, leaving behind a small projection that continues shaping neighborhoods, road layouts, and property divisions in a way few would guess by simply glancing at a map. People living inside this bump often hear stories about how simple disputes between neighbors centuries ago turned into permanent state-level decisions, leaving their homes within a border shape defined more by local arguments than by geography. Number 7 brings us to the California-Arizona River border, which shifted repeatedly as the Colorado River carved new paths, abandoning old channels and leaving behind dozens of outdated border points that no longer match the river's present shape. Residents near these abandoned channels often deal with questions about land that technically belongs to one state, while sitting closer to communities across the river, creating a tangle of responsibilities tied to a river that never stopped changing. Number 6 highlights the Michigan-Wisconsin island confusion, where treaty language left dozens of tiny islands assigned to one state or the other, with little consistency, creating a patchwork of ownership that sometimes surprises boaters exploring the region. Locals often describe how navigating these waters means crossing state boundaries without effort, passing islands that belong to a different jurisdiction while still sitting only a short distance from a shoreline controlled by the opposite state. Number 5 reveals the Colorado-Utah border jog. A sudden horizontal offset caused when surveyors disagreeing by a short distance created a visible bump that persists today, shaping county grids and confusing anyone expecting a perfectly straight meridian line. People living near this jog sometimes encounter it during routine activities, like land assessments or travel planning, discovering that the border's misalignment affects everything from local mapping systems to how state services draw their operational boundaries. Number 4 introduces the Ohio-Indiana kink, the result of two surveying teams reaching the same area with mismatched lines, leaving behind a visible shift that continues shaping farmland, road layouts, and local jurisdiction divisions in a surprisingly direct way. Residents in this region often learn how both lines were considered correct by their respective teams, creating a moment where compromise resulted in a kink that still cuts across modern properties despite later tools showing the mismatch clearly. Number 3 showcases the Kentucky-Tennessee jigsaw border, a wavy line drawn by settlers using rough maps and inconsistent scale, leaving behind a pattern so uneven that it feels more like a series of connected guesses than a planned state boundary. Families near this jigsaw section often grow up adjusting to property lines that stretch in unpredictable directions, shaped by decisions made with imprecise tools that froze a zigzag pattern into a landscape now filled with homes, schools, and farms. Number 2 focuses on the Maine-New Hampshire river boundary, filled with half-islands and divided properties where shifting river channels complicated ownership, leaving behind a border that often ignores the current direction of flowing water entirely. People near this boundary often deal with confusing property layouts, where a home may sit on one side of the river while the backyard technically falls under the opposite state, creating a patchwork of responsibilities shaped by unpredictable water patterns. Number 1 reaches the straight-looking western borders of North and South Dakota, which appear perfect on most maps until zoomed in, revealing tiny wobbles and offsets created when surveyors struggled to maintain accuracy across massive distances. Residents near these subtle imperfections rarely notice them during daily life, yet they represent the challenges faced by crews working with limited tools, proving that even the straightest borders hide flaws created by human hands rather than flawless precision. Together, these strange borders show how history, nature, error, and compromise carved lines across the country that still influence real communities, reminding us that maps are living records shaped by stories rather than neat, perfect designs.